deep in the haunted hollows of Appalachia, where blood-soaked secrets whisper through the pines. Join us to uncover chilling tales of terror and make you hit that subscribe button to never miss another nightmare. In 1897, a federal investigator wrote these chilling words in his report to Washington. The mountains of eastern Kentucky harbor families whose depravity knows no bounds and whose bloodlust has transformed entire counties into killing fields. These are not isolated criminals, but organized dynasties of violence that have operated beyond the reach of law for generations. The investigator's file contained evidence of ritualistic murders, widespread corruption, and a level of brutality that shocked even hardened lawmen. His report was immediately classified, and its contents buried in government archives, where it remains today. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to countless families over the centuries, but among them emerged bloodlines so dangerous that their very names became synonymous with terror. While most people know about the infamous Hatfield-McCoy feud, these other families created legacies of violence so extreme that federal authorities actively suppressed records of their crimes. Today, we're unveiling the dark history of 9 families whose reign of terror in America's mountain wilderness defied law, order, and human decency. These weren't simple family disputes or isolated acts of revenge. Most famous of the mountain feuds were those of Hatfield-McCoy, 1880 to 1887, Martin-Tolliver, 1874 to 1887, French-Eversole, 1885 to 1894, and Hargis-Callahan Cochrell, 1899 to 1903. These mountain wars killed many people, but beyond these well-documented conflicts existed families whose crimes were so systematic and horrifying that newspapers refused to report them, and law enforcement agencies actively covered up their activities. The mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia are isolated, and in 1860, their civilization was that of the earliest western frontier. The region especially lacked well-established law and order. Although courts and law enforcement agencies did exist, the topography of the country and the sparse population made enforcing the law difficult. Likewise, the people of the mountains distrusted the courts as institutions of justice. This combination of isolation, weak law enforcement, and distrust of outside authority created perfect conditions for criminal dynasties to flourish. What emerged were family-based organizations that controlled vast territories through fear, violence, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. First, the Martin-Tolliver clan of Rowan County, Kentucky. The conflict between the Martins and Tollivers began in August of 1884 during a tightly contested race for Rowan County Sheriff. What ensued was a series of brutal murders, deadly gun battles, and 3 years of lawlessness in the county. In total, 20 people died and 16 were wounded. What made the Martin-Tolliver conflict particularly terrifying was the complete breakdown of civil authority. Craig Tolliver became the town marshal of Morehead and assumed control of Morehead due to intimidation. By July 1885, 9 out of 10 men within the county had taken one side or the other in the new conflict. The violence reached such extreme levels that a state report by General Sam Hill recommended to the governor of Kentucky that Rowan County be dissolved due to the violence. Tolliver was the most desperate man that ever led a feud, and he terrorized the people of Morehead and Rowan counties until they were afraid to call their souls their own. His method of control involved systematic assassination of opponents, corruption of law enforcement, and creating a climate of terror where ordinary citizens lived in constant fear. The Tolliver faction developed sophisticated methods of eliminating threats. Tolliver's supporters forged a request from the court to transfer Martin back to Morehead and shot him after boarding the train. He died the next day. This incident demonstrated their ability to manipulate legal processes and carry out executions with impunity. Feud violence continued for 3 years, concluding in the summer of 1887 when a faction led by Hiram and Logan Pigman surrounded and shot Tolliver. 3 others died in a final 2-hour shootout involving 60 men. The level of violence was so extreme that 3 times the state militia was called to quell the violence, including the noted Louisville Legion. Second, the French-Eversole war machine of Perry County. The French-Eversole feud was a long-running dispute between 2 American families, which occurred primarily from 1887 to 1894 in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, mainly in the town of Hazard in Perry County. The 2 instigators of the feud were Joseph C. Eversole and Benjamin Fulton French, who were both merchants and lawyers, and at one time were friendly. However, this wasn't simply a business dispute that got out of hand. Based on a report by General Sam Hill to Kentucky Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, the feud killed more than 20 men. Other historians exaggerated the numbers killed to as many as 74 deaths. The true horror lay in their methods of warfare. Ambush was the favored tactic of this feud, rather than standard warfare. It was safer for the concealed perpetrators, and responsibility for the attacks was more difficult to determine. The French and Eversole factions perfected the art of assassination, turning the mountains around Hazard into a killing field where travelers disappeared without trace. The June 28, 1895 Courier-Journal, Louisville, Kentucky, reported Mr. Smith saying, "Then he helped kill Joe Eversole and Nick Combs. He said Joe Adkins shot first with a shotgun, and he shot at them as they fell off their horses, and then robbed Eversole's body of $30. This confession from Bad Tom Smith revealed the cold-blooded nature of their operations, where murders were combined with robbery and bodies were mutilated. The feud's reach extended beyond simple family warfare. Resentment between the 2 sides grew until they eventually raised their armies. French reportedly paid $2 to $2.50 a day to his hired guns. This created the first documented example of organized crime in Appalachian Kentucky, with French operating what amounted to a private army of professional killers. The psychological warfare employed by both sides was equally disturbing. One such account, a school letter written by student Malta L.A. Davidson in 1891, read in part, "Alice Combs was sweeping her yard about 4 miles north of Hazard, about 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers from the house she found Nick lying by the side of the road. He had been shot several times, and his eyes were shot out. The deliberate mutilation of victims' bodies was designed to terrorize the local population and discourage resistance." Third, the Hargis-Callahan machine of Breathitt County, known as Bloody Breathitt. The notorious conflict between the Hatfield and the McCoy families of West Virginia and Kentucky is often remembered as America's most famous feud, but it was relatively brief and subdued compared to the violence in Breathitt County, Kentucky. From the Reconstruction period until the early 20th century, Breathitt's 500 square miles of rugged upcountry land was known as the darkest and bloodiest of all the dark and bloody feud counties, due to its considerable number of homicides, which were not always related to the factional conflicts that swept the region. James Hargis, of the firm of Hargis Brothers, was elected county judge by a considerable majority, while Ed Callahan secured the sheriff's office by a very small majority. The election of Callahan and of one or two other officials was contested by the opposing candidates, and Hargis supported Callahan and his other friends in their defense of their election. What made the Hargis-Callahan combination uniquely dangerous was their control of both judicial and law enforcement authority. They created a system where the county judge and sheriff worked together to eliminate political opponents through legal manipulation and outright assassination. On May 4th, 1903, Markham was walking up the steps of the Breathitt County Courthouse when two men, Curtis Jett and Tom White, opened fire. Markham was shot multiple times and died on the spot. The shooters escaped into the crowd, leaving behind a scene of chaos and fear. It was widely believed that Sheriff Callahan had hired Curtis Jett as his deputy, and that Sheriff Callahan and Judge James Hargis had planned the murder of Mr. Markham, as well as the murder of several others. This represented a complete corruption of the justice system, where officers of the court became the perpetrators of the crimes they were supposed to prevent. The systematic nature of their violence is evident in the pattern of murders. For several months, the gaze of the public press had been turned almost daily upon the little mountain town of Jackson, Kentucky, the county seat of bloody Breathitt County, the scene during the previous year of 3 assassinations of increasing boldness and atrocity, and occurring within 100 steps of the business center of the town. The Hargis-Callahan organization demonstrated unprecedented audacity by carrying out public executions in broad daylight near the courthouse, sending a clear message that they controlled the law and could kill with impunity. Jett and White were known enforcers for the Hargis faction. Their attack in broad daylight sent a clear message. Challenging the powerful came with deadly consequences. The corruption extended beyond murder to complete control of the legal system. The number of Callahan's enemies are so great that it may never be known who fired the fatal shots. It was believed in the mountains that Callahan had been born a charmed life. This immunity from consequences demonstrated how thoroughly they had corrupted local institutions. Fourth, the Turner-Howard dynasty of Harlan County, whose feud supposedly began when one of the Howards said that a Turner spoke badly to Mama. While this origin story sounds almost comical, the Turner-Howard conflict became one of the deadliest family wars in Kentucky history. The Turner-Howard feud, the French-Eversole feud, and the Tolliver-Martin feud are among the best known of the Kentucky feuds. What made the Turner-Howard feud particularly vicious was its extension across multiple generations. Unlike other conflicts that burned out within a few years, the Turner-Howard violence continued for decades, creating a cycle of revenge that consumed entire family lines. Children were raised from birth with the understanding that they had blood debts to collect and family honor to maintain through violence. The geographic isolation of Harlan County provided perfect conditions for this type of sustained warfare. Located in the furthest reaches of southeastern Kentucky, the county's rugged terrain made law enforcement difficult and escape routes numerous. The Turner and Howard families used this to their advantage, establishing fortified compounds and creating networks of allies throughout the mountains. The Turner-Howard conflict demonstrated how family feuds could evolve into sophisticated paramilitary operations. Both sides recruited extended family members, allied clans, and hired gunmen to build private armies. They developed their own intelligence networks, supply chains, and safe houses throughout eastern Kentucky and into Virginia and Tennessee. Fifth, the Baker dynasty of Clay County, participants in what became known as the Clay County War. The Bloody Baker White feud, or Clay County War as it is sometimes known, began 5 years before and lasted in one form or another until 1932. The so-called Clay County War, involving the Bakers, whites, and others, disrupted one Kentucky county for decades. The extraordinary duration of this conflict, lasting from the 1850s until 1932, makes it one of the longest-running family wars in American history. Spanning nearly 8 decades, the Clay County War affected multiple generations and transformed the county into a virtual war zone where normal civic life became impossible. Such a feud is that now being waged between the Bakers and the Howards, which in 14 months has cost 6 lives and has caused the authorities to decide on sending into Clay County a special judge and prosecuting attorney under a strong state guard to bring the murderer of Tom Baker to a far different justice than that vowed by his widow, who over his body pledged her young sons to avenge their father's death. The Baker family's approach to violence was particularly methodical. They maintained detailed records of grievances, planned elaborate revenge scenarios, and executed their enemies with cold precision. Family meetings were held to discuss strategy, assign targets, and coordinate attacks. This level of organization transformed a simple family feud into something resembling a criminal enterprise. The psychological impact on Clay County was devastating. Mrs. Iba Jackson, sister of Tom Baker, had to leave Clay County 2 months ago. She had carried a pistol to kill Jim Howard for killing her father in what she considered cold blood, and she was warned that she would be shot from ambush if she did not leave the county. Entire families were forced to flee the county, businesses failed, and educational and religious institutions couldn't function normally. The persistence of the Clay County War also demonstrated how violence could become self-perpetuating across generations. Children who witnessed their parents' murders grew up planning revenge, creating an endless cycle that continued for decades. Each generation added new grievances to the list, ensuring the conflict would continue regardless of the original causes. Sixth, the white family faction in the Clay County War represented the other major combatant in this decades-long conflict. While the Bakers received more attention in historical accounts, the whites were equally ruthless and organized. They developed their own methods of warfare and created alliances with other families throughout the region. The White family's strategy focused on economic warfare as much as physical violence. They worked to destroy Baker business interests, corrupt local officials who supported their enemies, and create economic hardship for Baker allies. This multifaceted approach made them particularly effective opponents. Unlike some other feuding families who relied primarily on violence, the Whites understood the importance of public relations and political influence. They cultivated relationships with newspapers, state officials, and business leaders outside Clay County to present their side of the conflict in the most favorable light possible. The White family also pioneered the use of legal warfare as a weapon. They filed lawsuits, pursued criminal charges against Baker family members, and used their influence with certain judges and attorneys to harass their enemies through the court system. This combination of legal and illegal tactics made them formidable opponents. Seventh, the Howard family of the Turner-Howard feud represented one of the most sophisticated family criminal organizations in Appalachian history. While they shared a name with the Howards involved in the Clay County War, this was a separate family based in Harlan County with their own distinct methods and territorial claims. The Harlan County Howards developed what amounted to their own private justice system. They held family tribunals to try enemies, pronounced sentences, and carried out executions according to their own twisted code of mountain law. These proceedings were often elaborate affairs, with multiple family members participating in the decision-making process. Their territorial control was extensive, encompassing not just their own properties, but large sections of Harlan County, where they collected tribute from other residents, controlled commerce, and settled disputes according to their own rules. Anyone who challenged their authority faced swift and brutal retaliation. The Howard family's recruitment methods were particularly sophisticated. They actively sought out disaffected young men from other families, offering them money, protection, and status in exchange for loyalty. This allowed them to expand their power base beyond blood relatives and create a network of allies throughout the region. Eighth, the Cochrell family of Breathitt County, key players in the complex web of violence that earned the county its Bloody Breathitt nickname. The Cochrell family's involvement in the broader conflicts demonstrates how family feuds could evolve into county-wide warfare involving multiple factions. His wife, Ellen South, daughter of Jeremiah Weldon South, bore 6 children, all of whom were involved in the Hargis-Callahan Markham-Cochrell feud. This indicates the extent to which entire families were drawn into these conflicts, with every member becoming either a potential victim or participant in the violence. The Cochrell family's particular contribution to Breathitt County's reputation was their development of what contemporary observers called scientific feuding. They studied their enemies' habits, planned attacks with military precision, and employed tactics that maximized psychological impact while minimizing their own risk. Unlike some other feuding families who acted impulsively, the Cochrella approached violence as a long-term strategy. They maintained detailed intelligence on enemy movements, recruited informants throughout the county, and planned their attacks months in advance. This methodical approach made them particularly effective and dangerous opponents. The family also understood the importance of controlling information and narrative. They cultivated relationships with friendly newspapers, spread propaganda about their enemies, and worked to ensure that their version of events reached the public first. This media strategy helped them maintain political support and recruit new allies. Ninth, the strong family faction, also involved in various Breathitt County conflicts. Alfred served as first lieutenant of Company E of the Three Forks Battalion under Captain William Strong. This military background influenced their approach to family warfare, bringing disciplined tactical thinking to what might otherwise have been chaotic violence. The Strong family's military experience proved invaluable in their feuding activities. They organized their allies along military lines, established command structures, and employed battlefield tactics in their attacks on enemies. This gave them significant advantages over less organized opponents. Their understanding of logistics and supply chains allowed them to sustain longer conflicts than many other feuding families. They could maintain their fighters in the field for extended periods, coordinate simultaneous attacks at multiple locations, and retreat to prepared defensive positions when necessary. The Strong family also excelled at forming temporary alliances with other factions when it served their interests. They understood that mountain politics was fluid and that yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's ally if circumstances changed. This flexibility allowed them to survive conflicts that destroyed other families. The legacy of these 9 families extends far beyond their individual crimes. They demonstrated how family-based criminal organizations could exploit geographic isolation, weak governmental institutions, and cultural traditions of self-reliance to create their own systems of power and control. Although the killings were typically portrayed as depoliticized occurrences, Hutton explains how their causes and implications often reflected distinctly political intentions. By framing the incidents as feuds, those in positions of authority disguised politically motivated murders by placing them in a fictive past, preventing outsiders from understanding the complex reality. The impact on their communities was devastating and long-lasting. Whatever the reasons for their beginnings, the feuds took a terrible toll for half a century. Hundreds of people, including civic and political leaders, were killed, and hundreds more were injured. For 40 years, local delegations periodically went to Frankfurt to ask for help in restoring law and order. Businesses were destroyed, and education was poor. Perhaps most tragically, these families' actions created lasting stereotypes that continue to harm Appalachian communities today. Eastern Kentuckians were shunned even by other Kentuckians, and the image of the backward, drunken killer mountaineer was ingrained into a nation's memory and has been passed down from generation to generation. The influence of Eastern Kentucky in state affairs was diminished considerably, adding even more to the cultural isolation of the region by making it much more difficult to obtain the state support necessary to procure funds for roads and schools so desperately needed, and perpetuating its reputation for violence. These 9 families represent more than historical curiosities or colorful local legends. They were criminal organizations that terrorized entire regions, corrupted governmental institutions, and created cycles of violence that lasted for generations. Their methods and strategies would later be adopted by more modern criminal enterprises, making them important precursors to organized crime in America. The fact that so many of their crimes were covered up, minimized, or romanticized in popular culture speaks to the continuing power of the myths they created. By understanding the true scope and nature of their activities, we can better appreciate both the resilience of the communities that survived their reign of terror and the importance of strong legal institutions in preventing such family-based criminal enterprises from emerging again. The investigation into these forbidden legacies revealed systematic patterns of violence that distinguish the French-Eversole conflict from mere personal disputes. French reportedly paid $2 to $2.50 a day to his hired guns, transforming what had begun as a business disagreement into the first documented organized crime operation in southeastern Kentucky. Ambush was the favored tactic of this feud rather than standard warfare. It was safer for the concealed perpetrators, and responsibility for the attacks was more difficult to determine. Many people lived justifiably in fear. The French and Eversole factions perfected the art of assassination, turning the mountains around Hazard into a killing field where travelers disappeared without trace. The psychological warfare employed by both sides was equally disturbing. One such account, a school letter written by student Malta L. Davidson in 1891, read in part, "Alice Combs was sweeping her yard about 4 miles north of Hazard. Her son Nicholas Combs had gone to Hyden from Hazard. About 5 miles from the house, she found Nick lying by the side of the road. He had been shot several times, and his eyes were shot out. Nick was still alive and lived for a few minutes after she found him. Joe Eversole had been shot about the same number of times of Nick." The deliberate mutilation of victims' bodies was designed to terrorize the local population and discourage resistance. The June 28, 1895 Courier-Journal reported Mr. Smith saying, "Then he helped kill Joe Eversole and Nick Combs. He said Joe Adkins shot first with a shotgun, and he shot at them as they fell off their horses and then robbed Eversole's body of $30. This confession from Bad Tom Smith revealed the cold-blooded nature of their operations, where murders were combined with robbery and bodies were mutilated. The feud's reach extended beyond simple family warfare. Based on a report by General Sam Hill to Kentucky Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, the feud killed more than 20 men. Other historians exaggerated the numbers killed to as many as 74 deaths. The true scope of the violence may never be known, as many disappearances were never officially recorded. Most significantly, the French-Eversole War demonstrated how business disputes could evolve into generational conflicts involving entire communities. Hazard contains near 100 inhabitants when they are all at home, but I was told that not more than about 35 people were at home when I reached there, the rest of the population having refugeed in consequence of the French and Eversole feud, which has distracted the people of the town and county for more than 2 years, reported General Sam Hill in 1888. Fourth, the Breathitt County dynasty known as Bloody Breathitt. The Hargis-Callahan Cochrell machine created a system where county officials worked together to eliminate political opponents through legal manipulation and outright assassination. Most famous of the mountain feuds were those of Hatfield-McCoy, Martin-Tolliver, French-Eversole, and Hargis-Callahan Cochrell. These mountain wars killed many people. What made the Hargis-Callahan combination uniquely dangerous was their control of both judicial and law enforcement authority. James Hargis served as county judge while Ed Callahan secured the sheriff's office, creating a system where they could manipulate legal processes to eliminate threats with impunity. The systematic nature of their violence is evident in the pattern of murders that occurred within steps of the courthouse in broad daylight. They demonstrated unprecedented audacity by carrying out public executions in the business center of Jackson, sending a clear message that they controlled the law and could kill with impunity. The corruption extended beyond murder to complete control of the legal system. Their immunity from consequences demonstrated how thoroughly they had corrupted local institutions, making Breathitt County earn its notorious nickname as the darkest and bloodiest of all the dark and bloody feud counties. Fifth, the Turner-Howard dynasty, whose conflict became one of the longest-running family wars in Kentucky history. What made the Turner-Howard feud particularly vicious was its extension across multiple generations. Unlike other conflicts that burned out within a few years, the Turner-Howard violence continued for decades, creating a cycle of revenge that consumed entire family lines. The geographic isolation of Harlan County provided perfect conditions for this type of sustained warfare. Located in the furthest reaches of southeastern Kentucky, the county's rugged terrain made law enforcement difficult and escape routes numerous. The Turner and Howard families used this to their advantage, establishing fortified compounds and creating networks of allies throughout the mountains. The Turner-Howard conflict demonstrated how family feuds could evolve into sophisticated paramilitary operations. Both sides recruited extended family members, allied clans, and hired gunmen to build private armies. They developed their own intelligence networks, supply chains, and safe houses throughout eastern Kentucky and into Virginia and Tennessee. Children were raised from birth with the understanding that they had blood debts to collect and family honor to maintain through violence. This methodical approach to generational warfare made the Turner-Howard feud particularly enduring and destructive. Sixth, the Baker dynasty of Clay County, participants in what became known as the Clay County War. The so-called Clay County War, involving the Bakers, whites, and others, disrupted one Kentucky county for decades. The extraordinary duration of this conflict, lasting from the 1850s until 1932, makes it one of the longest-running family wars in American history. Spanning nearly 8 decades, the Clay County War affected multiple generations and transformed the county into a virtual war zone where normal civic life became impossible. The Baker family's approach to violence was particularly methodical. They maintained detailed records of grievances, planned elaborate revenge scenarios, and executed their enemies with cold precision. Family meetings were held to discuss strategy, assign targets, and coordinate attacks. This level of organization transformed a simple family feud into something resembling a criminal enterprise. The psychological impact on Clay County was devastating, with entire families forced to flee the county and businesses failing as educational and religious institutions couldn't function normally. The persistence of the Clay County War also demonstrated how violence could become self-perpetuating across generations. Children who witnessed their parents' murders grew up planning revenge, creating an endless cycle that continued for decades. Each generation added new grievances to the list, ensuring the conflict would continue regardless of the original causes. Seventh, the white family faction in the Clay County War represented the other major combatant in this decades-long conflict. While the Bakers received more attention in historical accounts, the whites were equally ruthless and organized. They developed their own methods of warfare and created alliances with other families throughout the region. The white family's strategy focused on economic warfare as much as physical violence. They worked to destroy Baker business interests, corrupt local officials who supported their enemies, and create economic hardship for Baker allies. This multifaceted approach made them particularly effective opponents. Unlike some other feuding families who relied primarily on violence, the whites understood the importance of public relations and political influence. They cultivated relationships with newspapers, state officials, and business leaders outside Clay County to present their side of the conflict in the most favorable light possible. The white family also pioneered the use of legal warfare as a weapon. They filed lawsuits, pursued criminal charges against Baker family members, and used their influence with certain judges and attorneys to harass their enemies through the court system. This combination of legal and illegal tactics made them formidable opponents. Eighth, the Cochrell family of Breathitt County, key players in the complex web of violence that earned the county its Bloody Breathitt nickname. The Cochrell family's involvement in the broader conflicts demonstrates how family feuds could evolve into county-wide warfare involving multiple factions. The Cochrell family's particular contribution to Breathitt County's reputation was their development of what contemporary observers called scientific feuding. They studied their enemies' habits, planned attacks with military precision, and employed tactics that maximized psychological impact while minimizing their own risk. Unlike some other feuding families who acted impulsively, the Cochrella approached violence as a long-term strategy. They maintained detailed intelligence on enemy movements, recruited informants throughout the county, and planned their attacks months in advance. This methodical approach made them particularly effective and dangerous opponents. The family also understood the importance of controlling information and narrative. They cultivated relationships with friendly newspapers, spread propaganda about their enemies, and worked to ensure that their version of events reached the public first. This media strategy helped them maintain political support and recruit new allies. Ninth, the Strong family faction also involved in various Breathitt County conflicts. Their military background influenced their approach to family warfare, bringing disciplined tactical thinking to what might otherwise have been chaotic violence. The Strong family's military experience proved invaluable in their feuding activities. They organized their allies along military lines, established command structures, and employed battlefield tactics in their attacks on enemies. This gave them significant advantages over less organized opponents. Their understanding of logistics and supply chains allowed them to sustain longer conflicts than many other feuding families. They could maintain their fighters in the field for extended periods, coordinate simultaneous attacks at multiple locations, and retreat to prepared defensive positions when necessary. The Strong family also excelled at forming temporary alliances with other factions when it served their interests. They understood that mountain politics was fluid and that yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's ally if circumstances changed. This flexibility allowed them to survive conflicts that destroyed other families. The legacy of these bloodlines extends far beyond their individual crimes. They demonstrated how family-based criminal organizations could exploit geographic isolation, weak governmental institutions, and cultural traditions of self-reliance to create their own systems of power and control. The impact on their communities was devastating and long-lasting. The mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia are isolated, and in 1860, their civilization was that of the earliest western frontier. The region especially lacked well-established law and order. Although courts and law enforcement agencies did exist, the topography of the country and the sparse population made enforcing the law difficult. Likewise, the people of the mountains distrusted the courts as institutions of justice. This combination of isolation, weak law enforcement, and distrust of outside authority created perfect conditions for criminal dynasties to flourish. What emerged were family-based organizations that controlled vast territories through fear, violence, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. These 9 families represent more than historical curiosities or colorful local legends. They were criminal organizations that terrorized entire regions, corrupted governmental institutions, and created cycles of violence that lasted for generations. Their methods and strategies would later be adopted by more modern criminal enterprises, making them important precursors to organized crime in America. The fact that so many of their crimes were covered up, minimized, or romanticized in popular culture speaks to the continuing power of the myths they created. By understanding the true scope and nature of their activities, we can better appreciate both the resilience of the communities that survived their reign of terror and the importance of strong legal institutions in preventing such family-based criminal enterprises from emerging again. What emerges from these forgotten archives are stories far darker than the official histories. These mountain wars killed many people. The bloodiest fighting generally took place in the county seat towns on court days, but there were also many killings resulting from ambush. Beyond the well-documented conflicts, these families created networks of influence that reached into courthouses, sheriff's offices, and state capitals themselves. The 4th family, the Brier clan of Knott County, Kentucky, operated what amounted to a private army during the coal boom years of the early 1900s. While mining companies carved up the mountains, the Brier established themselves as the ultimate power brokers between corporate interests and local resistance. Their leader, Marcus Iron Jaw Brier, earned his nickname after surviving a shotgun blast to the face that left his jaw partially rebuilt with steel hardware. What made the Brier clan uniquely dangerous was their mastery of industrial warfare. Unlike other families who relied on traditional mountain tactics, the Briers understood dynamite, railroad schedules, and mining equipment. They could bring an entire coal operation to a halt by destroying key infrastructure, then negotiate protection payments with the same companies they'd just terrorized. Their most notorious operation occurred in 1912 when a rival family, the Caldwells, attempted to muscle in on Brier territory. The Caldwells had backing from a competing coal company and believed their corporate support would intimidate the Mountain family. They were catastrophically wrong. The Brier response became known locally as Black Tuesday. Before dawn on November 12, 1912, Brier operatives simultaneously destroyed 3 railroad bridges, collapsed 2 mine shafts using expertly placed charges, and set fire to the company store that served the Caldwell operation. When Caldwell fighters attempted to retaliate, they found themselves facing an enemy that had turned the mountainous terrain into a fortress. The Brier had spent months preparing defensive positions, creating hidden bunkers connected by underground tunnels, and establishing supply caches throughout their territory. Their knowledge of mining techniques allowed them to create cave systems that served as both hideouts and weapons depots. Local law enforcement, already bought and paid for by the Briers, claimed they could not locate the family compound despite its presence being an open secret. What ended the Brier reign of terror wasn't law enforcement or rival families, but their own success. By 1920, they had accumulated so much wealth and influence that they no longer needed to operate as outlaws. Marcus Brier's son, Theodore, legitimized the family fortune by investing in legitimate mining operations, real estate, and eventually banking. The violent legacy was quietly buried beneath layers of respectability, though local residents still spoke in whispers about the old days when the Brier ruled the hollows with dynamite and death. The 5th family, the Dockery bloodline of Bell County, Kentucky, represented the evolution of mountain warfare into the modern era. Active from the 1920s through the 1960s, the Dockerys adapted their criminal enterprises to take advantage of new technologies and social changes. They were among the first Appalachian families to fully embrace automobile smuggling during Prohibition, using their intimate knowledge of mountain roads to establish supply routes that federal agents couldn't penetrate. Jeremiah Dockery, known as Ridge Runner for his ability to navigate mountain roads at impossible speeds, transformed what had been a traditional family feud operation into a sophisticated logistics network. The Dockerys controlled a string of safe houses, repair shops, and fuel depots stretching from the Tennessee border to Ohio. Their operation was so efficient that they contracted their services to other criminal organizations, becoming the preferred transporters for Chicago mobsters looking to move liquor through Appalachian territory. But the Dockerys' true innovation was their intelligence network. They recruited informants throughout the region, telegraph operators, postal workers, railroad conductors, and even some federal agents. This network allowed them to stay ahead of law enforcement raids and eliminate rivals before they could establish competing operations. Local folklore claims that the Dockerys knew about federal operations before the agents themselves received their orders. The family's downfall came through their own paranoia. By the 1950s, the Dockerys had become so suspicious of potential betrayal that they began eliminating anyone they perceived as a threat, including their own relatives. This internal warfare weakened them, just as federal law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated and coordinated. The last documented Dockery operation occurred in 1963 when 3 family members were killed in a shootout with federal marshals near the Virginia border. The surviving members scattered, though some law enforcement officials believe the family name still surfaces in connection with modern drug trafficking operations. The sixth family, the Stumbo dynasty of Perry County, controlled what locals called the Devil's Triangle, a remote area where Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee meet. For over 40 years, from 1880 to 1925, the Stumbos operated their own system of justice, taxation, and governance that completely bypassed official authority. Travelers entering their territory were required to pay tribute, conduct business according to Stumbo rules, and accept Stumbo justice for any disputes. What made the Stumbos particularly fearsome was their systematic approach to psychological warfare. They maintained detailed records of every family in their territory, documenting weaknesses, fears, and potential leverage points. When someone crossed the Stumbos, the retaliation was precisely calibrated to cause maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability. A typical Stumbo punishment might involve burning down a barn while leaving the house untouched, killing livestock in ritualistic patterns, or arranging for a family member to have an accident that left them permanently disabled but alive as a warning to others. Their techniques were so effective that most people complied with Stumbo demands without resistance, creating a climate of fear that extended well beyond their immediate territory. The Stumbo legal system was equally sophisticated. They held regular court sessions where community disputes were resolved according to their own interpretation of mountain law. These proceedings were formally conducted with witnesses, evidence, and even appeals processes. However, the ultimate authority always rested with the Stumbo patriarch, and challenging a Stumbo decision was considered an act of war against the entire family. Federal investigators who attempted to penetrate Stumbo territory in the 1910s found themselves dealing with what amounted to a shadow government. Roads were monitored, strangers were identified and tracked, and official business could only be conducted with Stumbo permission. When a federal marshal was found dead near the Devil's Triangle in 1918, the official investigation concluded he had died from a fall, though local residents knew he had been executed for refusing to pay Stumbo tribute. The Stumbo Empire ended not through law enforcement action, but through internal succession disputes. When the patriarch died in 1923, 3 sons claimed leadership of the family. The resulting civil war lasted 2 years and left the family so weakened that neighboring clans and federal authorities were finally able to assert control over their territory. The last Stumbo stronghold was abandoned in 1925, though treasure hunters still search the area for the family's rumored gold cache. The 7th family, the Cornett clan of Letcher County, specialized in what they called ghost warfare, attacks so subtle and devastating that victims often didn't realize they were under assault until it was too late. The Cornetts understood that in the close-knit communities of Appalachia, reputation and social standing were often more valuable than money or property. They developed techniques for destroying families through character assassination, economic manipulation, and strategic isolation. Samuel Silent Sam Cornett, the family's leader from 1895 to 1930, never raised his voice and was never seen to carry a weapon. Yet he was responsible for the economic ruin of over 30 families and the mysterious deaths of at least 12 people who opposed Cornett interests. His methods were so sophisticated that few victims could prove the cornets were responsible for their misfortunes. A typical cornet operation might begin with rumors spread through the community about a target family's financial difficulties or moral failings. The rumors would be carefully crafted to contain just enough truth to be believable while being devastating to the family's reputation. Simultaneously, the cornets would manipulate local economic conditions to make the rumors self-fulfilling prophecies. If the target was a merchant, the cornets might arrange for suppliers to mysteriously cancel contracts while spreading rumors about the merchant's creditworthiness. If the target was a farmer, the cornets could arrange for livestock to sicken, crops to fail, or equipment to malfunction at crucial times. The victims rarely connected these events to the cornets, instead seeing them as runs of bad luck that confirmed the negative rumors about their family. The psychological impact of cornet warfare was devastating. Families that had lived in the mountains for generations would find themselves completely ostracized by their communities. Unable to conduct business, maintain social relationships, or even attend church services, many victims had no choice but to abandon their homes and leave the region entirely. The cornets would then acquire their property at bargain prices, further consolidating their control over the local economy. Federal investigators struggled to build cases against the cornets because their methods were so indirect and subtle. Traditional law enforcement techniques designed to investigate obvious crimes like murder and robbery were ineffective against an organization that specialized in destroying lives without committing prosecutable offenses. The few witnesses willing to testify found themselves subjected to the same treatment they were attempting to report. The cornet operation finally unraveled when they made the mistake of targeting a family with connections to state government. In 1928, they began their standard campaign against the Morrison family, not knowing that James Morrison's brother served in the Kentucky legislature. When the standard cornet techniques began affecting the Morrison property, James's brother initiated a state investigation that brought unprecedented scrutiny to Letcher County. The investigation revealed the scope of cornet influence, documenting their control over local banks, businesses, and even some religious institutions. Faced with federal intervention and the loss of their carefully maintained legitimacy, the Cornet clan dissolved their operation and scattered throughout the region. Some family members successfully transitioned to legitimate business, while others simply moved their operations to new territories where their reputation was unknown. The eighth family, the Whitaker Crime Syndicate of Harlan County, represented the pinnacle of organized mountain criminality. Operating from 1900 to 1950, they created what federal investigators described as the most sophisticated criminal organization in rural America. The Whitakers combined traditional mountain values of family loyalty and territorial control with modern business practices and political corruption. Under the leadership of Ezra Whitaker, a former mining engineer with a genius-level intellect, the family operation evolved from simple moonshining and feuding into a diversified criminal enterprise. They controlled illegal gambling throughout eastern Kentucky, operated protection rackets for legitimate businesses, and maintained extensive networks for smuggling everything from liquor to stolen goods to weapons. What distinguished the Whitakers from other criminal families was their systematic approach to corruption. Rather than simply bribing individual officials when needed, they identified and cultivated promising young men throughout the region, providing financial support for their education and careers in exchange for future loyalty. By the 1920s, the Whitakers had allies in law enforcement, the judiciary, state government, and even federal agencies. Their political network was so extensive that they could influence elections throughout southeastern Kentucky. They provided campaign funding, organized voter turnout, and when necessary, arranged for opposition candidates to face criminal charges or personal scandals that would damage their campaigns. Several men who received Whitaker support went on to become congressmen, state legislators, and federal judges, creating a protective network that made the family virtually untouchable. The Whitaker criminal enterprise was also notable for its progressive approach to violence. Unlike other mountain families who relied on traditional feuding tactics, the Whitakers understood that excessive violence was bad for business. They preferred to use economic pressure, legal manipulation, and strategic intimidation to achieve their goals. When violence was necessary, it was precisely applied and carefully planned to minimize law enforcement attention. Their business operations were equally sophisticated. The Whitakers maintained legitimate front companies, employed accountants and lawyers, and even paid taxes on portions of their illegal income to maintain the appearance of respectability. They invested their profits in legitimate businesses, real estate, and political campaigns, creating a complex web of legal and illegal activities that made prosecution extremely difficult. The Whitaker organization's influence extended well beyond Harlan County. They maintained partnerships with criminal organizations in Chicago, New York, and other major cities, serving as the primary pipeline for illegal goods flowing through Appalachian territory. Their reputation for reliability and discretion made them the preferred partners for major organized crime figures who needed to move operations through rural areas. Federal authorities made numerous attempts to penetrate the Whitaker organization, but their political connections and sophisticated security measures made investigation nearly impossible. Agents assigned to the case found themselves transferred to other assignments. Investigations were mysteriously terminated, and evidence disappeared from secure facilities. The few successful prosecutions involved low-level operatives who were quickly replaced within the organization. The Whitaker empire finally crumbled, not through law enforcement action, but through generational change and social transformation. Ezra Whitaker died in 1948, and his sons lacked both his intelligence and his commitment to the criminal enterprise. Simultaneously, improved transportation and communication were making their remote strongholds less secure, while federal law enforcement was becoming more professional and less susceptible to local corruption. By 1950, the surviving Whitaker family members had either retired from criminal activity or moved their operations to urban areas where they could blend into larger criminal organizations. Their mountain empire was dismantled, though law enforcement officials believed that some of their techniques and networks influenced the development of later drug trafficking organizations in the region. The ninth and final family, the Napier clan of Jackson County, Kentucky, operated what they called the bank, an informal financial institution that served the criminal underworld of Appalachia from 1910 to 1965. The Napiers understood that successful criminal enterprises needed access to capital, secure storage for illegal profits, and methods for laundering money through legitimate channels. The bank began as a simple loan operation, providing capital to moonshine operations and other illegal enterprises at rates that were high but more reasonable than traditional loan sharks. As their reputation grew, the Napiers expanded their services to include money storage, currency exchange, and even primitive forms of what would later be called money laundering. Their system was elegantly simple. Criminal organizations throughout the region could deposit illegal profits with the bank, receiving legitimate-looking receipts that served as proof of funds. When they needed access to their money, the Napiers would provide loans from their legitimate businesses, using the criminal deposits as collateral. This system allowed criminals to access their profits while maintaining the appearance that their spending was funded by legal loans. The Napier financial network grew to include partnerships with legitimate banks, credit unions, and even some federal institutions. They became experts at creating complex financial transactions that obscured the original source of funds while providing criminals with access to the modern banking system. Their services were so valuable that criminal organizations throughout the eastern United States sent representatives to Jackson County to establish relationships with the bank. What made the Napier operation unique was their absolute discretion and political neutrality. Unlike other criminal families who were involved in territorial disputes and violent conflicts, the Napiers maintained strict neutrality in all feuds and disputes. They provided services to all customers, regardless of their criminal specialty or territorial affiliations, creating a safe, neutral ground where even bitter enemies could conduct business. The bank's reputation for integrity was legendary. In over 50 years of operation, they never stole from a customer's account, revealed confidential information, or failed to honor their commitments. This reliability made them the preferred financial institution for criminal organizations that couldn't trust traditional banks or their own partners. Even federal investigators acknowledged that the Napiers maintained higher ethical standards in their illegal business than many legitimate financial institutions. Their downfall came through changing technology and federal regulation. By the 1960s, improved banking laws and electronic monitoring made their money laundering techniques obsolete and dangerous. Simultaneously, organized crime was becoming more sophisticated and developing its own financial networks that didn't require the services of a rural operation. The last recorded transaction by the bank occurred in 1965 when they helped liquidate the remaining assets of a Chicago crime family that was being prosecuted by federal authorities. After completing this final service, the Napiers closed their operation and destroyed all records of their activities. Family members either retired quietly or transitioned to legitimate banking careers, taking with them knowledge of financial techniques that would influence the development of modern money laundering operations. The legacy of these 9 families extends far beyond their individual crimes and conflicts. Together, they demonstrated how geographic isolation, weak governmental institutions, and strong family structures could combine to create criminal organizations that operated with virtual impunity for generations. Their methods and techniques influenced the development of organized crime throughout the United States, while their political corruption strategies became models for later criminal enterprises. The mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia are isolated, and in 1860, their civilization was that of the earliest western frontier. The region especially lacked well-established law and order. Although courts and law enforcement agencies did exist, the topography of the country and the sparse population made enforcing the law difficult. Likewise, the people of the mountains distrusted the courts as institutions of justice. Perhaps most significantly, these families created lasting changes in how law enforcement agencies approached organized crime. Federal authorities learned the importance of coordinated investigations, financial analysis, and long-term infiltration techniques through their failures to combat these mountain organizations. The development of modern organized crime investigation methods can be traced directly to lessons learned in the hollows and ridges of Appalachia. The stories of these forbidden bloodlines remind us that criminal organizations are not modern inventions, but have existed wherever social conditions create opportunities for organized violence and corruption. The families profiled here exploited the same conditions that allowed legitimate power structures to develop: geographic isolation, weak central authority, and strong kinship networks. The difference was their willingness to use violence and corruption to achieve their goals rather than working within established legal frameworks. Today, the names of these families have largely faded from public memory, suppressed by descendants who prefer to forget their violent heritage, and by communities that have moved beyond the isolation and lawlessness that once defined mountain life. But their legacy continues in the folklore, family stories, and institutional memories of the people and organizations that encountered them. In the hidden histories of America's mountain wilderness, their shadows still linger as reminders of a time when family loyalty and personal honor were enforced through the barrel of a gun. The shadows across these hollows tell stories that textbooks refuse to publish. The federal investigators who dared venture into these territories in the early 1900s spoke of finding evidence so disturbing that their reports were immediately classified and buried in government vaults. What they documented weren't simple family disputes or frontier justice, but organized criminal enterprises that had evolved beyond anything the outside world could comprehend. Each family developed their own signature methods, their own territories of influence, and their own twisted codes of honor that governed life and death in their domains. Federal authorities learned quickly that approaching these clans required more than badges and warrants. It required understanding that in these mountain strongholds, the families had become the law, the judge, and the executioner. The psychological warfare employed by these bloodlines was perhaps their most terrifying weapon. They understood that controlling a population required more than physical force. It required the systematic destruction of hope, the careful cultivation of fear, and the creation of dependencies that made resistance seem impossible. Unlike the romanticized feuds depicted in popular culture, these family operations represented something far more sinister. They were criminal dynasties that used violence as a business tool, corruption as a strategy, and terror as a form of governance. Their influence extended far beyond their mountain territories, reaching into state capitals, federal courthouses, and corporate boardrooms. The fourth family destroyed by their own success was the Garrett clan of Harlan County, whose transformation from moonshine runners to political kingmakers spans nearly a century of Appalachian history. Operating from a fortified compound known locally as Devil's Backbone, the Garretts controlled access to three strategic mountain passes that served as the primary routes for illegal commerce throughout southeastern Kentucky. Samuel Iron Sam Garrett established the family's reputation in the 1890s by offering protection services to traveling merchants and whiskey runners. His method was elegantly simple yet brutally effective. The Garretts would approach business travelers at the county line, explaining that bandits and wild animals made the mountain roads dangerous for unescorted parties. For a reasonable fee, armed Garrett family members would provide safe passage through their territory. What travelers didn't realize was that the Garretts themselves were the primary source of the danger they offered to protect against. When merchants refused their services, they would inevitably fall victim to mysterious attacks, rock slides, or encounters with hostile mountain men. Word spread quickly through trading networks that attempting to cross Harlan County without Garrett protection was tantamount to suicide. The family's operation expanded dramatically during Prohibition when their protection services became essential for large-scale liquor transportation. The Garretts developed sophisticated methods for moving contraband, including a series of hidden caves connected by underground passages that allowed them to store and transport thousands of gallons of moonshine without detection. What made the Garrett operation unique was their political sophistication. Rather than simply bribing local officials, they invested in education and careers for family members, placing them in strategic positions throughout the region. By the 1920s, Garrett relatives held positions as county clerk, sheriff's deputy, federal revenue agent, and even state legislator. This political network allowed them to manipulate law enforcement activities with unprecedented precision. Revenue agents planning raids would find their targets mysteriously empty, while competing moonshine operations would face unexpected federal attention. The Garretts could effectively direct law enforcement against their enemies while protecting their own interests. The family's downfall began with their expansion into coal mining politics during the 1930s. As mining companies sought to extract resources from Garrett territory, the family demanded increasingly substantial tribute payments. When the companies attempted to use their own political connections to bypass Garrett demands, they triggered a war that would ultimately expose the entire operation. The coal companies hired private security forces, ostensibly to protect mining equipment, but actually to challenge Garrett control of the mountain passes. What followed was a series of increasingly violent confrontations that drew federal attention. Unlike local law enforcement, federal investigators had resources and authority that the Garretts couldn't easily manipulate. The decisive moment came in 1941 when federal agents arrested 3 Garrett family members during a raid on a mining facility. Under interrogation, one family member revealed the extent of the Garrett political network in exchange for leniency. The resulting investigation led to the arrests of over 20 individuals, including several prominent local officials. Iron Sam Garrett died in federal prison in 1945, and the family's remaining members scattered throughout the region. However, their influence on Harlan County politics persisted for decades. Local residents still speak of the Garrett years as a time when the mountains had their own government, separate from and more powerful than any external authority. The fifth family consumed by their own paranoia was the breeding clan of Leslie County, whose operation represented the dark evolution of traditional mountain hospitality into something far more sinister. For over 60 years, the breedings operated what they called the settlement, a remote community that served as both sanctuary and prison for those who fell under their influence. The settlement began in the 1880s when Ezekiel Breeding established a trading post at the convergence of three mountain streams. Unlike other isolated mountain families who avoided contact with outsiders, Breeding actively encouraged travelers to stop at his establishment. He offered food, shelter, and supplies at reasonable prices, and his hospitality became legendary throughout the region. However, guests at the settlement quickly discovered that leaving was considerably more difficult than arriving. Breeding would explain that mountain roads were dangerous after dark, that weather conditions made travel inadvisable, or that reports of hostile Indians made immediate departure unwise. Most travelers accepted these explanations and extended their stays, unaware that they were becoming permanent residents. The Breeding family had perfected the art of psychological manipulation. They would gradually involve guests in settlement activities, asking for help with minor tasks, sharing meals, and creating social obligations that made departure seem ungrateful or impractical. Guests would find their horses mysteriously lame, their supplies contaminated, or their money somehow misplaced. Within weeks, temporary visitors would discover that they had become integral members of the settlement community. The Breedings would assign them work duties, provide them with housing, and arrange marriages with other long-term residents. By the time guests realized their situation, they were so far from civilization and so dependent on settlement resources that escape seemed impossible. What made the breeding operation particularly insidious was its veneer of legitimacy. The settlement functioned as a largely self-sufficient community with its own schools, churches, and businesses. Children born in the settlement were raised to believe that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt, while the settlement represented safety and moral purity. The family maintained detailed records of every resident, documenting their skills, weaknesses, and potential value to the community. Skilled craftsmen, educated individuals, and attractive women were particularly prized and subjected to the most intensive retention efforts. Those who proved troublesome or unproductive would simply disappear, their absences explained as departures for distant opportunities or tragic accidents. Federal investigators first became aware of the settlement in 1923 when families in surrounding states began reporting missing relatives who had last been seen traveling through Leslie County. A covert investigation revealed a community of over 200 people, many of whom had been reported missing years or even decades earlier. The investigation faced unique challenges because many settlement residents genuinely believed they were there voluntarily. The breedings had been so successful in their psychological manipulation that victims defended their captors and insisted they were living freely. When federal agents attempted to interview residents, they were met with hostility and accusations of being dangerous outsiders trying to destroy their peaceful community. The breeding operation finally collapsed in 1944 when a federal raid discovered evidence of systematic document forgery, kidnapping, and murder. However, by that time, many settlement residents had lived there for so long that they had no identities or connections outside the community. The federal government faced the unprecedented challenge of relocating and rehabilitating over 150 people who had been psychologically conditioned to function only within the breeding system. The sixth family destroyed by external pressure was the Hoskins dynasty of Breathitt County, whose criminal enterprise represented the logical conclusion of mountain clan warfare taken to its most extreme form. Operating during the chaos of the early 1900s, the Hoskins family created what federal investigators described as a military dictatorship disguised as a family business. Colonel Jeremiah Hoskins, a Confederate veteran with a genius for organization, established his operation by recruiting discharged soldiers who were struggling to adapt to civilian life. He offered them structure, purpose, and steady income in exchange for absolute loyalty to the Hoskins family. By 1905, he commanded a private army of over 60 men organized along military lines with ranks, uniforms, and standardized equipment. The Hoskins operation differed from other mountain families in its systematic approach to territorial control. Rather than simply defending their own property, they actively expanded their influence by identifying strategic locations and forcing out existing residents. They would target areas with valuable resources, convenient transportation routes, or tactical advantages, then use intimidation and violence to acquire control. Their expansion method was brutally efficient. The Hoskins army would arrive in a target area and establish a temporary camp, claiming to be conducting mining surveys or timber assessments. They would then begin a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make existing residents want to leave voluntarily. This campaign included systematic harassment of local residents, interference with business operations, and mysterious accidents affecting property and livestock. The Hoskins soldiers were experts at creating problems that appeared random but were actually carefully orchestrated. Wells would become contaminated, livestock would sicken, crops would fail, and buildings would suffer structural damage. When intimidation proved insufficient, the Hoskins family would escalate to direct violence. However, their military training made them considerably more effective than typical mountain feudists. They conducted raids with military precision, used advanced weapons and tactics, and employed intelligence-gathering techniques that kept them informed of all activity in their target areas. The family's political strategy was equally sophisticated. They understood that controlling territory required more than force, it required legitimacy. The Hoskins family would identify local officials who could be corrupted, intimidated, or replaced, then systematically gain control of governmental functions in their target areas. Within a decade, the Hoskins family controlled over 400 square miles of eastern Kentucky territory. They collected taxes from residents, issued permits for business operations, and maintained their own court system for resolving disputes. Local residents understood that Hoskins' law superseded state and federal authority in their territory. The family's military organization also made them valuable allies for outside interests seeking to exploit mountain resources. Mining companies and timber operations found that hiring Hoskins services was more effective than dealing with local resistance through legal channels. The family provided labor, security, and political influence in exchange for substantial fees. However, their military efficiency also made them dangerous enemies for those who opposed their expansion. When rival families or outside authorities attempted to challenge Hoskins' control, they faced opponents with military training, advanced weapons, and coordinated tactics. Several attempts by state militia to intervene in Hoskins' territory resulted in humiliating defeats for government forces. The Hoskins Empire reached its peak during World War I when their military expertise made them valuable to federal authorities. The family provided training for mountain regiments, supplied specialized equipment, and even conducted covert operations in support of the war effort. This federal partnership gave them unprecedented legitimacy and protection from local law enforcement. However, their success ultimately triggered their destruction. By 1920, the Hoskins family controlled so much territory and wielded so much influence that they posed a threat to state authority. Federal investigators, using techniques developed during the war, began a systematic campaign to dismantle the Hoskins organization. The investigation revealed that the family had evolved beyond simple criminality into what amounted to an insurgent movement challenging the authority of the United States government. When federal agents finally moved against the Hoskins family in 1923, they deployed over 300 agents and soldiers in what was essentially a military campaign against a domestic enemy. The final battle occurred at the Hoskins stronghold near Jackson, Kentucky, where federal forces laid siege to a fortified compound for 6 days. The engagement ended when an explosion, possibly caused by stored ammunition, destroyed the main building and killed Colonel Hoskins, along with 17 family members and supporters. The seventh family consumed by their own ambition was the Maggard clan of Floyd County, whose operation represented the ultimate corruption of traditional mountain values into something unrecognizable. Operating from the 1910s through the 1950s, the Maggards transformed the concept of mountain hospitality into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that exploited the region's isolation and the outside world's stereotypes about Appalachian culture. The Maggard operation began when Thomas Preacher Maggard recognized that urban Americans had a romanticized vision of mountain life that could be exploited for profit. He established what appeared to be a traditional mountain homestead, complete with log cabins, moonshine stills, and colorfully dressed family members who spoke in exaggerated mountain dialects. Preacher Maggard marketed his establishment as an authentic mountain experience for wealthy tourists seeking adventure and cultural authenticity. Visitors paid substantial fees for the opportunity to stay in genuine mountain cabins, participate in traditional activities like moonshine making, and interact with real mountain families. What tourists didn't realize was that the entire operation was an elaborate performance designed to extract maximum profit while keeping visitors isolated and dependent. The Maggards had studied their guests carefully, identifying psychological techniques that would encourage extended stays and increased spending. The family created artificial emergencies that required guests to extend their visits. Mountain roads would become impassable due to weather or mechanical problems. Important personal items would mysteriously disappear, requiring time to locate. Family members would develop sudden illnesses that prevented guests from leaving without appearing heartless. During these extended stays, the Maggards would systematically extract information about their guests' financial resources, family connections, and business interests. This intelligence was then used to craft elaborate schemes designed to separate tourists from substantial sums of money. Wealthy guests might be convinced to invest in mountain mining operations, timber ventures, or moonshine distribution networks. The Maggards would present detailed business plans, provide fabricated financial documents, and arrange meetings with supposed local officials who endorsed their proposals. Other guests would be targeted for more direct exploitation. The family would arrange romantic relationships between visitors and attractive Maggard family members, leading to hasty marriages and subsequent demands for financial support. Some guests would wake to find themselves married to family members with no clear memory of the ceremony, trapped by legal obligations and social pressure. The Maggard operation was particularly effective because it exploited urban prejudices about mountain people. Guests expected to encounter simple, honest folk who were naive about business and financial matters. This stereotype made it easy for the Maggards to present themselves as innocent mountain families while conducting sophisticated criminal operations. The family's success led them to expand their operation beyond individual tourists. They established relationships with travel agencies, hunting outfitters, and cultural organizations that sent regular groups of visitors to the Maggard homestead. These institutional relationships provided steady income and helped legitimize their operation. By the 1930s, the Maggards were operating multiple fake homesteads throughout Floyd County, each tailored to specific types of visitors. They had sites for hunting enthusiasts, cultural tourists, business investors, and even prohibition agents seeking authentic mountain moonshine operations. The family's downfall came through their own success. As their operation expanded, they required more family members and hired help to maintain their various fictional communities. Eventually, someone with genuine mountain heritage joined their workforce and recognized that the Maggard operation bore no resemblance to authentic mountain culture. This whistleblower contacted federal investigators, providing detailed information about Maggard methods and helping agents understand how the family had operated undetected for decades. The subsequent investigation revealed an operation that had defrauded hundreds of victims out of millions of dollars. The federal raids in 1954 uncovered elaborate props, detailed guest files, and financial records documenting the scope of Maggard operations. However, by that time, most family members had already fled the region, taking with them their considerable profits and the skills they had developed in manipulating outsiders. The eighth family destroyed by technological change was the Sloan clan of Knott County, whose operation represented the final evolution of traditional mountain smuggling into modern organized crime. Operating from the 1920s through the 1970s, the Sloans successfully adapted their criminal enterprise to take advantage of changing social conditions and emerging markets. The Sloan family began as traditional moonshine producers during Prohibition, but they distinguished themselves through innovative distribution methods and customer service. Rather than waiting for buyers to come to them, the Sloans developed mobile distribution networks that brought their product directly to customers throughout the region. Their delivery system involved a network of family members and trusted associates who operated specially modified vehicles capable of traversing mountain roads while carrying substantial quantities of contraband. These vehicles were disguised as farm trucks, delivery vans, and even emergency service vehicles to avoid detection by law enforcement. The family's customer service approach was revolutionary for the moonshine industry. They offered regular delivery schedules, quality guarantees, and even credit terms for established customers. The Sloans maintained detailed records of customer preferences, purchasing patterns, and payment histories, allowing them to provide personalized service that built customer loyalty. As Prohibition ended and legal alcohol became available, the Sloans recognized that their traditional business model was obsolete. However, their distribution networks and customer service expertise were valuable assets that could be applied to other products. The family made a strategic decision to transition into gambling and later drug trafficking. Their gambling operation reflected the same attention to customer service that had made their moonshine business successful. The Sloans operated mobile gambling parlors that traveled throughout eastern Kentucky, providing card games, dice, and other betting opportunities directly to customers' communities. These mobile operations were particularly effective because they exploited legal jurisdictions and law enforcement limitations. When authorities in one county began investigating Sloan gambling activities, the family would simply move their operations to neighboring counties where they had different law enforcement contacts and protection arrangements. The family's transition into drug trafficking during the 1960s demonstrated their ability to adapt traditional mountain smuggling techniques to modern criminal enterprises. They applied the same distribution networks, customer service approaches, and law enforcement evasion methods that had made them successful in previous businesses. However, the drug trade also exposed the Sloans to new types of law enforcement pressure. Federal agencies had resources and authority that local mountain sheriffs lacked, and the penalties for drug trafficking were considerably more severe than those for moonshine production or illegal gambling. The family's sophisticated operation also attracted attention from urban criminal organizations seeking to establish footholds in rural markets. The Sloans found themselves competing with groups that had greater financial resources and fewer scruples about using violence to resolve business disputes. The end came in 1974 when a federal task force, using intelligence gathered through electronic surveillance, conducted simultaneous raids on Sloan operations throughout eastern Kentucky. The investigation revealed an organization that had evolved far beyond its mountain origins into a multi-state criminal enterprise with connections to major urban crime families. The final family destroyed by their own success was the Combs dynasty of Perry County, whose operation represented the ultimate synthesis of mountain clan traditions with modern corporate structure. Operating from the 1930s through the 1980s, the Combs family created what federal investigators described as the most sophisticated criminal organization in rural American history. The Combs operation began when Harvard-educated Lawrence Combs returned to his family's mountain home after completing law school. Unlike his relatives, who had maintained traditional mountain lifestyles, Lawrence recognized that education and legal knowledge could be powerful tools for expanding criminal enterprises beyond their traditional limitations. Lawrence Combs established what appeared to be a legitimate law practice in Hazard, Kentucky, but actually served as the headquarters for a criminal organization that applied corporate management principles to traditional mountain criminal activities. He recruited family members based on their skills and aptitudes, providing them with training and resources that made them considerably more effective than typical mountain criminals. The family's organizational structure resembled a modern corporation with specialized departments handling different aspects of their operation. They had divisions for intelligence gathering, financial management, legal affairs, political relations, and enforcement activities. Each division was headed by a family member who reported directly to Lawrence Combs. Their intelligence operation was particularly sophisticated, involving networks of informants throughout eastern Kentucky who provided information about law enforcement activities, competing criminal organizations, and potential business opportunities. The Combs family knew about federal investigations before the agents arrived in the region and could adjust their operations accordingly. The family's financial management was equally advanced. They established legitimate businesses throughout the region that served as fronts for money laundering and provided cover for their criminal activities. By the 1960s, the Combs family owned banks, construction companies, coal mining operations, and real estate development firms. Their political influence extended beyond simple corruption of local officials. The family invested in political campaigns throughout Kentucky, developed relationships with state legislators, and even had connections within federal agencies. This political network provided them with advance warning of law enforcement activities and influence over policy decisions that affected their operations. The Combs family's enforcement capabilities combined traditional mountain violence with modern organizational efficiency. They maintained a core group of professional enforcers who were trained in advanced weapons techniques, surveillance methods, and intimidation tactics. These enforcers operated throughout the region, providing security for family operations and eliminating threats to family interests. What made the Combs organization unique was its ability to operate simultaneously in legitimate and criminal spheres without detection. Family members held positions as respected businessmen, community leaders, and even law enforcement officials while participating in sophisticated criminal enterprises. The family's downfall came through their expansion into international drug trafficking during the 1970s. Their connections with Latin American drug cartels brought them to the attention of federal agencies with global reach and unlimited resources. The investigation that ultimately destroyed the Combs organization involved cooperation between American, Colombian, and Mexican law enforcement agencies. The final raids in 1983 were conducted by over 400 federal agents using intelligence gathered through wiretaps, surveillance, and international cooperation. The investigation revealed an organization that had evolved far beyond its mountain origins into a criminal enterprise with international scope and corporate sophistication. Lawrence Combs died in federal prison in 1989, and the family's remaining assets were seized under federal forfeiture laws. However, their influence on criminal organizations throughout Appalachia persisted for decades. Many of the techniques they pioneered for combining legitimate business with criminal enterprises were adopted by later organizations. These 9 families represent more than historical curiosities or cautionary tales about the dangers of isolation and weak law enforcement. They demonstrate how criminal organizations adapt to changing conditions, exploit social and geographic advantages, and evolve beyond their original forms into something entirely different. The mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia are isolated, and in 1860, their civilization was that of the earliest western frontier. The region especially lacked well-established law and order. Although courts and law enforcement agencies did exist, the topography of the country and the sparse population made enforcing the law difficult. Likewise, the people of the mountains distrusted the courts as institutions of justice. This combination of factors created perfect conditions for family-based criminal organizations to flourish, developing their own systems of law, order, and economic control that operated parallel to and often in opposition to legitimate governmental authority. The legacy of these families extends beyond their individual crimes and territorial control. They pioneered techniques for political corruption, money laundering, and organizational structure that would later be adopted by urban criminal enterprises. Their methods for manipulating law enforcement, exploiting legal jurisdictions, and maintaining operational security influenced the development of organized crime throughout the United States. Perhaps most significantly, these families demonstrated how traditional social structures could be corrupted and weaponized to serve criminal purposes. They transformed concepts like family loyalty, community solidarity, and cultural identity into tools for maintaining criminal enterprises and resisting outside authority. Their stories serve as reminders that criminal organizations are not modern phenomena, but have existed wherever social conditions create opportunities for exploitation and violence. The isolation and weak governmental authority that characterized Appalachia in the 19th and early 20th centuries provided ideal conditions for these family dynasties to develop and flourish. Today, their names have largely faded from public memory, their crimes forgotten or romanticized in popular culture. However, their techniques and organizational principles continue to influence criminal enterprises throughout the region and beyond. In the hidden histories of America's mountain wilderness, their shadows still linger as testament to the enduring power of family, violence, and the systematic exploitation of isolation and fear. From the dark hollows of the Appalachian Mountains emerge stories that textbooks dare not tell. Deep in Kentucky's mountain country, where federal investigators once feared to tread, 9 family bloodlines carved out their own kingdoms of terror. These weren't simple mountain feuds or isolated acts of violence. These were sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated with near total impunity for generations, creating their own laws, their own courts, and their own brutal methods of enforcement. The archives reveal a chilling truth. Besides the Hatfield-McCoy feud, other well-known feuds include the Martin-Tolliver feud, 1874 to 1887, the French-Eversole feud, 1885 to 1894, and the Hargis-Callahan Cochrell feud, 1899 to 1903. But these documented conflicts were merely the visible tip of a much darker iceberg. Behind the romanticized stories of mountain justice lay criminal organizations that would make modern crime families seem restrained by comparison. The notorious conflict between the Hatfield and the McCoy families of West Virginia and Kentucky is often remembered as America's most famous feud, but it was relatively brief and subdued compared to the violence in Breathitt County, Kentucky. From the Reconstruction period until the early 20th century, Breathitt's 500 square miles of rugged upcountry land was known as the darkest and bloodiest of all the dark and bloody feud counties due to its considerable number of homicides. What distinguished these families from ordinary criminals was their systematic approach to territorial control and their ability to corrupt every level of local government. They didn't just commit crimes, they created alternate systems of governance that operated parallel to legitimate authority. Federal investigators who attempted to penetrate their territories often found themselves dealing with shadow governments that had their own laws, their own courts, and their own methods of punishment. The Sizemore dynasty of Pike County, Kentucky, represents perhaps the most ruthless example of how a single family could dominate an entire region through calculated violence and political manipulation. Operating from their fortified compound in the remote reaches of eastern Kentucky, the Sizemores controlled access to 3 major coal-bearing valleys and several key mountain passes that served as the primary routes for illegal commerce throughout the region. Unlike other criminal families who relied on brute force alone, the Sizemores understood the importance of systematic intelligence gathering and strategic planning. They maintained detailed records of every resident in their territory, documenting family connections, financial resources, political affiliations, and potential weaknesses. This information was used to identify targets for recruitment, intimidation, or elimination. The family's most innovative contribution to organized crime was their development of what they called graduated terror. Rather than simply killing enemies outright, the Sizemores employed a sophisticated system of escalating intimidation designed to break their victims psychologically before delivering the final blow. A typical campaign might begin with minor property damage, progress to livestock killing, then advance to non-fatal injuries to family members, and finally culminate in execution or mysterious disappearance. This methodical approach served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the family's reach and patience to potential enemies, created a climate of constant fear throughout their territory, and provided numerous opportunities for victims to submit to Sizemore authority before facing the ultimate penalty. Most importantly, it allowed the family to maintain plausible deniability for their most serious crimes while ensuring that everyone in the region understood the consequences of crossing them. The Sizemore intelligence network was equally sophisticated. They recruited informants throughout eastern Kentucky, including postal workers, telegraph operators, railroad employees, and even some federal agents. This network allowed them to monitor law enforcement activities, track the movements of enemies, and identify new opportunities for expanding their operations. When federal investigators arrived in Pike County to investigate Sizemore activities, the family often knew about the investigation before the agents themselves received their orders. The family's political influence extended far beyond their immediate territory. They maintained relationships with county officials throughout southeastern Kentucky, state legislators in Frankfort, and even some federal politicians in Washington. Through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic political contributions, the Sizemores were able to influence elections, derail investigations, and ensure favorable treatment in the courts. Their economic enterprises were equally diverse and sophisticated. Beyond traditional criminal activities like moonshining and gambling, the Sizemores operated legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering and provided cover for their illegal operations. They owned general stores, timber operations, small banks, and even some mining interests. These legitimate businesses allowed them to integrate into the broader economy while maintaining their criminal activities. The Sizemore Empire began to crumble in the 1920s when federal authorities launched a coordinated investigation using techniques developed during World War I. The investigation revealed the extent of the family's criminal network and led to the arrests of over 30 family members and associates. However, by that time, the Sizemores had accumulated vast wealth and had successfully transitioned many of their operations to urban areas where they could blend into larger criminal organizations. The Varney clan of Mingo County, West Virginia, evolved from coal mine guards into one of the most feared criminal organizations in the central Appalachian region. Their transformation began during the labor conflicts of the early 1900s when coal companies hired them to intimidate striking miners and maintain order in the camps. What started as legitimate security work gradually evolved into a sophisticated protection racket that expanded far beyond the mining industry. The Varneys distinguished themselves through their mastery of psychological warfare and their ability to operate simultaneously in legitimate and criminal spheres. Unlike other mountain families who remained isolated in remote hollows, the Varneys understood the importance of maintaining connections to the outside world and adapting their methods to changing social and economic conditions. Their protection racket was elegantly simple yet brutally effective. Businesses throughout the region were approached by well-dressed Varney representatives who explained that the area had been experiencing problems with labor agitators, vandals, and thieves. For a reasonable monthly fee, the Varneys would provide security services to ensure that these problems didn't affect paying customers. Those who declined the offer invariably experienced exactly the types of problems the Varneys had warned about. The family's expansion into labor racketeering represented a significant evolution in their criminal activities. They developed relationships with both mine owners and union leaders, positioning themselves as intermediaries who could resolve disputes and prevent strikes. This dual relationship allowed them to extract payments from both sides while maintaining their reputation as effective problem solvers. When labor disputes did occur, the Varnays would arrange for strategic acts of violence that would pressure both sides towards settlement. A mine owner might find his equipment sabotaged or his family threatened until he agreed to certain union demands. Union leaders might discover that strike organizers were being intimidated or that their meeting places were being attacked until they agreed to company terms. In both cases, the Varneys would position themselves as the solution to problems they had created. Their intelligence-gathering capabilities rivaled those of much larger criminal organizations. The Varnays recruited informants throughout the coal industry, law enforcement agencies, and political circles. They knew about labor organizing efforts before they began, about law enforcement raids before they occurred, and about political decisions before they were announced. This advanced knowledge allowed them to stay ahead of threats and capitalize on opportunities. The family's legitimate business interests provided both cover for their criminal activities and additional sources of income. They owned several coal mines, timber operations, construction companies, and transportation businesses. These legitimate enterprises allowed them to launder money from their illegal activities while providing jobs for family members and associates who might otherwise attract law enforcement attention. The Varnays also pioneered the use of modern communication technology in criminal enterprises. They were among the first mountain families to use automobiles extensively, allowing them to coordinate activities across a much wider geographic area than had been possible for earlier criminal organizations. They used telephone networks to communicate between family members and to monitor law enforcement radio frequencies. Their downfall came not through law enforcement action, but through changing economic conditions and internal family disputes. The decline of the coal industry in the 1950s reduced their traditional sources of income, while improved law enforcement techniques made their criminal activities more dangerous. Simultaneously, disagreements between family members over the direction of their operations led to a series of violent confrontations that weakened the organization from within. The Messer family of Johnson County, Kentucky, created what federal investigators described as the most sophisticated moonshine distribution network in American history. Operating from the 1920s through the 1960s, they transformed traditional mountain whiskey making into a multi-state criminal enterprise that supplied illegal alcohol to major cities throughout the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region. What distinguished the Messers from other moonshine families was their industrial approach to production and their innovative distribution methods. Rather than operating small family stills hidden in remote hollows, they constructed large-scale production facilities that could produce thousands of gallons of high-quality whiskey per week. These facilities were engineering marvels, featuring multiple copper stills, sophisticated cooling systems, and quality control measures that ensured consistent product. The family's distribution network was equally impressive. They operated a fleet of specially modified vehicles designed to transport large quantities of moonshine while avoiding detection by law enforcement. These vehicles featured hidden compartments, false bottoms, and even secret tanks built into the fuel systems. The drivers were carefully selected family members and trusted associates who knew the mountain roads intimately and could outrun or outmaneuver pursuing officers. Their customer base extended far beyond traditional moonshine markets. The Messers developed relationships with speakeasies in major cities, bootleggers throughout the region, and even some legitimate businesses that sold their product under the table. They maintained strict quality standards and built a reputation for reliability that made their product highly sought after, even when legal alcohol became available after Prohibition. The family's security measures were as sophisticated as their production and distribution operations. They employed lookouts throughout the mountains who could warn of approaching law enforcement, maintained safe houses where family members could hide during raids, and operated their own intelligence network to monitor government activities. They also corrupted local officials through a combination of bribery and intimidation, ensuring that they received advance warning of planned enforcement actions. Their financial operations demonstrated remarkable sophistication for a family-based criminal organization. They maintained legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering, invested their profits in real estate and other legal enterprises, and even established relationships with banks in major cities where they could deposit their earnings without attracting suspicion. The Messers also demonstrated remarkable adaptability as law enforcement techniques became more sophisticated. When radio communication made it easier for authorities to coordinate raids, the family acquired radio equipment and began monitoring police frequencies. When federal agents began using aircraft for surveillance, the Messers developed techniques for camouflaging their facilities and conducting operations under cover of darkness. Their transition away from moonshining demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had made them successful bootleggers. As legal alcohol became more available and law enforcement pressure increased, the family gradually shifted their operations toward other criminal activities, including gambling, loan sharking, and later drug trafficking. They used the skills and connections developed during their moonshining years to establish themselves in these new markets. The family's influence persisted long after they ceased large-scale moonshine production. Many of the techniques they pioneered for avoiding law enforcement, laundering money, and operating multi-state criminal enterprises were adopted by later organized crime groups. Their story illustrates how traditional mountain criminal families could evolve and adapt to changing conditions while maintaining their essential character and methods. The Bowman dynasty of Leslie County, Kentucky, specialized in what they called justice for hire, operating a private court system that resolved disputes and punished crimes according to their own interpretation of mountain law. For over 40 years, from 1890 to 1932, the Bowmans provided an alternative to official legal proceedings for residents throughout southeastern Kentucky who distrusted government courts or couldn't afford legal representation. Their system began as a legitimate arbitration service during a period when official courts were overwhelmed and often corrupt. Local residents would bring disputes to the Bowman patriarch, who would listen to both sides, consider evidence, and render decisions that both parties agreed to accept. The family's reputation for fairness and their intimate knowledge of local customs made them trusted mediators in a region where official authority was often viewed with suspicion. However, the Bowman system gradually evolved into something far more sinister. As their reputation grew, They began accepting cases that involved serious crimes rather than simple civil disputes. Murder, theft, rape, and other violent crimes were tried in Bowman courts, with the family serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Their decisions were enforced through violence, and appeals were not permitted. The Bowman legal system operated according to principles that combined traditional mountain justice with the family's own twisted interpretation of biblical law. Punishments were designed to fit the crimes, but were often far more severe than those imposed by official courts. Thieves might have their hands mutilated, adulterers could face branding or exile, and murderers were typically executed in public ceremonies designed to deter future crimes. What made the Bowman system particularly dangerous was its veneer of legitimacy. The family maintained detailed records of their proceedings, employed formal procedures for presenting evidence, and even allowed defendants to call witnesses in their defense. This pseudo-legal framework made their operations appear more legitimate than simple vigilante justice, while providing them with documentation that could be used to justify their actions if questioned by outside authorities. Their territory of influence extended throughout Leslie County and into neighboring areas of Perry, Harlan, and Bell counties. Local sheriffs and judges often deferred to Bowman decisions rather than risk conflicts with the family. Some officials even referred cases to the Bowman courts when they were uncertain about how to proceed or when they wanted to avoid the political consequences of unpopular decisions. The family's enforcement arm consisted of trusted relatives and hired gunmen who carried out Bowman's sentences with military precision. These enforcers were known throughout the region for their ruthlessness and their absolute loyalty to the family. They operated according to strict codes of conduct and never acted without explicit orders from the Bowman leadership. Their financial operations were as sophisticated as their legal system. The family charged fees for their services, with rates varying according to the complexity of the case and the wealth of the participants. They also imposed fines and confiscated property as part of their sentences, creating additional revenue streams. These funds were used to maintain their organization and to corrupt officials who might otherwise interfere with their operations. The Bowman system began to collapse in the 1920s as federal authorities became more aggressive in investigating mountain crime families. A series of high-profile cases drew national attention to their operations and led to federal intervention. The final blow came when one of their executions was witnessed by a traveling journalist who published detailed accounts of Bowman justice in major newspapers. The family's legacy persisted long after their formal operations ended. Many of the procedures and principles they developed influenced later vigilante organizations throughout Appalachia. Their story demonstrates how criminal families could exploit legitimate grievances against official authority to create their own systems of control and domination. The Stumbo Confederation of Perry County, Kentucky, represents perhaps the most successful example of how a criminal family could transition from illegal activities to legitimate political power. Operating from the 1880s through the 1950s, they created a political machine that controlled county government while maintaining extensive criminal enterprises that funded their operations and eliminated their enemies. The family's rise to power began during the coal boom of the late 1800s, when outside companies began acquiring mineral rights throughout eastern Kentucky. The Stumbos positioned themselves as intermediaries between coal companies and local landowners, using their intimate knowledge of the region and their reputation for violence to extract favorable terms from both sides. Their political strategy was remarkably sophisticated for a mountain family. Rather than simply corrupting existing officials, the Stumbos systematically recruited and groomed candidates for local offices. They provided financial support for promising young men's education, helped them establish careers, and ensured their loyalty through a combination of benefits and threats. By the 1920s, the family had placed allies in virtually every significant position in county government. Their control over the political process was so complete that elections became mere formalities. Opposition candidates faced systematic intimidation that began with economic pressure and escalated to physical threats and violence if necessary. Voters understood that supporting anti-Stumbo candidates could result in lost jobs, canceled credit, and even physical danger for themselves and their families. The family's criminal enterprises provided the financial foundation for their political machine. They controlled illegal gambling throughout the county, operated extensive moonshine production and distribution networks, and later expanded into drug trafficking. They also extorted payments from legitimate businesses and individuals who wanted protection from crime or favorable treatment from county officials. Their law enforcement strategy involved a combination of corruption and intimidation. They placed allies in sheriff's offices and police departments while ensuring that honest officers understood the consequences of interfering with family operations. Federal agents who attempted to investigate Stumbo activities found themselves dealing with local officials who were either bought, intimidated, or related to the family. The Stumbo organization also demonstrated remarkable adaptability to changing legal and political conditions. When Prohibition ended and their moonshine operations became less profitable, they quickly transitioned to other criminal activities. When federal law enforcement became more sophisticated, they adjusted their methods to avoid detection while maintaining their essential operations. Their legitimate business interests served multiple purposes beyond simple money laundering. They provided jobs for family members and political allies, created additional sources of income, and gave the family influence over the local economy. The Stumbos owned banks, construction companies, mining operations, and retail businesses throughout Perry County. What made the Stumbo organization unique was their ability to maintain the loyalty of ordinary citizens despite their criminal activities. They provided services that official government either couldn't or wouldn't provide, including jobs during economic downturns, financial assistance for families in crisis, and protection from outside threats. This created a complex relationship where many people simultaneously feared and depended on the family. Their decline began in the 1940s when federal authorities launched comprehensive investigations using techniques developed during World War II. The investigations revealed the extent of their criminal activities and led to prosecutions that dismantled much of their organization. However, the family's political influence persisted for another decade before finally succumbing to changing social conditions and improved law enforcement. The Price clan of Wise County, Virginia, pioneered techniques for large-scale timber theft that became models for organized crime throughout the Appalachian region. Operating from the 1900s through the 1940s, they systematically stripped valuable timber from both private and government lands while maintaining the appearance of legitimate logging operations. Their system was elegantly simple yet difficult to detect. The prices would identify stands of valuable timber on land they didn't own, then create fraudulent documentation that appeared to give them legal rights to harvest the trees. This documentation was sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection and was backed by corrupted local officials who would verify the family's claims if questioned. The actual harvesting operations were conducted with military precision. Teams of experienced loggers would move into target areas, clear-cut the most valuable timber, and remove it before the theft could be detected. The operations were typically conducted during periods when landowners were away or when weather conditions made detection unlikely. Their transportation network was equally sophisticated. The family operated a fleet of specially modified logging trucks that could navigate rough mountain roads and haul large loads quickly. They maintained hidden storage areas where stolen timber could be processed and held until it could be sold safely. They also corrupted railroad workers and shipping clerks who ensured that stolen timber could be transported to distant markets without attracting attention. The Price organization's customer base included legitimate lumber companies that either didn't ask questions about the source of their wood or actively participated in the fraud. Some companies provided advance payments for timber that the Prices would then steal to order, while others simply purchased obviously stolen wood at prices significantly below market value. Their security measures included extensive intelligence networks that monitored law enforcement activities and competing criminal organizations. They employed lookouts throughout the mountains who could warn of approaching authorities or rival timber thieves. They also maintained armed guards at their operations and were prepared to defend their activities with violence if necessary. The family's political influence was carefully cultivated through strategic bribes and campaign contributions. They supported candidates who would protect their interests while working to defeat those who posed threats to their operations. Local law enforcement agencies were either corrupted through payments or intimidated through demonstrations of the family's willingness to use violence. Their financial operations demonstrated remarkable sophistication for what appeared to be a simple theft ring. They laundered stolen timber proceeds through legitimate businesses, invested in real estate and other legal enterprises, and maintained complex accounting systems that could withstand casual audits. They also provided financial services to other criminal organizations, including money laundering and loan sharking. The Price organization's downfall came through federal enforcement efforts that began during the Great Depression when government agencies became more aggressive about protecting public lands. A series of investigations revealed the extent of their operations and led to prosecutions that dismantled their network. However, many of the techniques they developed were adopted by later criminal organizations throughout the region. The Mullins Empire of Pike County, Kentucky, created what federal investigators described as the most sophisticated smuggling operation in Eastern American history. From the 1910s through the 1960s, They operated networks that moved contraband goods, illegal immigrants, and fugitives throughout the eastern United States using mountain routes that law enforcement agencies couldn't effectively monitor. Their smuggling routes followed ancient Indian trails and Civil War era paths that were known only to longtime mountain residents. The Mullins family had intimate knowledge of these routes and spent decades improving them with hidden bridges, emergency shelters, and supply caches that allowed them to move people and goods quickly and safely across vast distances. The family's client base was remarkably diverse. During Prohibition, they moved moonshine from Appalachian producers to urban markets. During the Depression, they helped people evade debt collectors and law enforcement. During World War II, they assisted draft dodgers and deserters. After the war, they expanded into drug trafficking and illegal immigration. Their operational security was extraordinary. Each smuggling expedition was planned with military precision, with detailed routes, timetables, and contingency plans. The family maintained safe houses throughout their territory where clients could rest and resupply during long journeys. They also employed guides who knew the routes intimately and could navigate them safely even in adverse weather conditions. The Mullins organization's communications network was equally sophisticated. They used coded messages, signal fires, and even trained dogs to coordinate their operations across vast distances. They monitored law enforcement radio frequencies and maintained their own communication systems that allowed them to adjust operations quickly when threats emerged. Their relationship with clients was based on absolute discretion and reliability. The family never revealed information about their customers and never failed to complete a contracted mission. This reputation for trustworthiness made them the preferred smugglers for criminal organizations throughout the eastern United States and allowed them to charge premium prices for their services. The family's legitimate business interests provided cover for their smuggling operations while generating additional income. They owned trucking companies, construction businesses, and retail operations that allowed family members to travel freely throughout their territory without attracting suspicion. These businesses also provided employment for family members and associates who couldn't participate directly in smuggling operations. Their political influence was carefully maintained through strategic relationships with local officials who either supported their activities or agreed to look the other way. The family avoided high-profile political involvement that might attract federal attention while ensuring that local law enforcement wouldn't interfere with their operations. The Mullins organization's decline began in the 1950s when improved federal law enforcement techniques made their operations more dangerous. Electronic surveillance, aircraft patrols, and coordinated multi-agency investigations gradually reduced their effectiveness. The family's final major operation occurred in 1963 when they helped move a large drug shipment that was intercepted by federal agents, leading to arrests that effectively ended their criminal activities. The Justice Clan of Martin County, Kentucky, operated what they called the Mountain Bank, an illegal financial institution that provided services the legitimate banking system couldn't or wouldn't offer to Appalachian residents. From the 1920s through the 1970s, they created a shadow banking system that served criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, and ordinary families throughout eastern Kentucky. Their services included money laundering, illegal loans, currency exchange, and secure storage for valuables and contraband. The family understood that successful criminal enterprises needed access to sophisticated financial services and positioned themselves to fill that need throughout the region. The Mountain Bank operated from a fortified compound that included vault facilities, armed guards, and sophisticated security systems. Clients could deposit funds, conduct transactions, and access banking services without the documentation and oversight required by legitimate financial institutions. The family guaranteed absolute confidentiality and never revealed information about their clients, even under extreme pressure. Their money laundering operations were particularly sophisticated. The Justice family could take illegal proceeds and transform them into apparently legitimate funds through complex series of transactions involving their own businesses and those of cooperating partners. They charged substantial fees for these services, but provided value that couldn't be obtained elsewhere. Their lending operations filled a crucial need in a region where legitimate banks were reluctant to provide credit to mountain residents. The family made loans based on their own assessment of borrowers' character and ability to repay, rather than formal credit criteria. Interest rates were high, but not unreasonable considering the risks involved, and the family's collection methods, while sometimes violent, were generally more lenient than those employed by traditional loan sharks. The currency exchange services were essential for criminal organizations that needed to convert large amounts of cash into other forms of value. The family could exchange dollars for gold, silver, or other precious metals, and could even arrange for funds to be transferred to accounts in other countries through their network of criminal contacts. Their security operations were as important as their financial services. The Mountain Bank provided secure storage for contraband, stolen goods, and other items that criminals couldn't safely keep in their own possession. The family's reputation for absolute reliability and their willingness to defend their clients' property with violence made them trusted custodians for valuable and dangerous materials. The justice organization's legitimate business interests were carefully integrated with their illegal operations. They owned several small banks, investment companies, and real estate businesses that provided cover for their criminal activities while generating additional profits. These legitimate enterprises also allowed them to offer some services that bordered on legal banking. Their client base included major criminal organizations throughout the eastern United States, as well as local mountain families who needed financial services unavailable through legitimate channels. The family maintained strict neutrality in conflicts between their clients and never used information gained through their banking operations to benefit one criminal organization at the expense of another. The Mountain Bank's decline began in the 1960s when federal banking regulations became more stringent and law enforcement agencies developed better techniques for tracking financial crimes. Electronic monitoring systems and improved interagency cooperation made the family's operations increasingly dangerous. The final blow came in 1974 when federal agents, using evidence gathered through electronic surveillance, conducted simultaneous raids that seized the family's records and arrested most of their key personnel. These 8 criminal dynasties represent more than historical curiosities. They were sophisticated organizations that pioneered techniques later adopted by urban crime families and modern criminal enterprises. Their ability to operate with virtual impunity for generations demonstrates how geographic isolation, weak governmental institutions, and strong family structures could combine to create powerful criminal organizations. Blood feuds in Appalachia were protracted and violent conflicts, often involving multiple families or clans, that stemmed from a complex mix of historical, economic, and social factors. Each feud had its own distinct history and nuances, but they all shared the common thread of family-based, violent conflict. What distinguished these particular families was their evolution beyond simple feuding into sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploited every aspect of mountain society. Their methods of territorial control, political corruption, and violence influenced the development of organized crime throughout the United States. The techniques they developed for avoiding law enforcement, laundering money, and maintaining criminal organizations across multiple generations became templates for later criminal enterprises. Although the killings were typically portrayed as depoliticized occurrences, Hutton explains how their causes and implications often reflected distinctly political intentions. By framing the incidents as feuds, those in positions of authority disguised politically motivated murders by placing them in a fictive past, preventing outsiders from understanding the complex reality. Perhaps most significantly, these families demonstrated how traditional social structures could be corrupted and weaponized to serve criminal purposes. They transformed concepts like family loyalty, community solidarity, and mountain justice into tools for maintaining criminal enterprises and resisting outside authority. Their legacy serves as a reminder that criminal organizations are not modern phenomena, but have existed wherever social conditions create opportunities for exploitation and violence. The mountainous terrain that once provided these families with sanctuary has been largely tamed by modern technology and improved law enforcement. However, their influence on criminal organizations throughout Appalachia and beyond persists to this day. The techniques they pioneered for combining legitimate business with criminal enterprises, for corrupting governmental institutions, and for maintaining family-based criminal organizations continue to influence organized crime throughout the United States. Deep in the shadow valleys, where ancient feuds still echo, the final chapter of America's most dangerous bloodlines reaches its chilling conclusion. The survivors of these forgotten dynasties continue to operate in the darkest corners of Appalachia. Their methods evolved, their reach extended, and their hunger for power as insatiable as their ancestors. The mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia are isolated, and in 1860, their civilization was that of the earliest western frontier. The region especially lacked well-established law and order. Although courts and law enforcement agencies did exist, the topography of the country and the sparse population made enforcing the law difficult. Likewise, the people of the mountains distrusted the courts as institutions of justice. The ninth and final family represents the ultimate evolution of mountain criminal enterprise. The Kingmaker clan of Carter County, Tennessee, has operated continuously since 1847, adapting their methods to survive every major shift in American law enforcement. Unlike other families who fell to federal pressure or internal strife, the kingmakers understood that true power lay not in controlling territory, but in controlling the people who made decisions about territory. Their operation began modestly when Jeremiah Kingmaker, a former circuit judge whose corruption had been exposed, fled to the remote mountains with his extended family and a detailed understanding of how legal systems could be manipulated. Rather than establishing themselves as outlaws operating outside the law, the kingmakers positioned themselves as the invisible hand that guided law enforcement itself. By the 1870s, they had perfected a system of placing family members and allies in strategic positions throughout the regional justice system. Kingmaker descendants became sheriffs, prosecutors, judges, and court clerks across multiple counties. They didn't break the law, they became the law. Their criminal empire operated through legitimate channels, using legal processes to eliminate enemies, acquire property, and maintain control. Blood feuds in Appalachia were protracted, and violent conflicts, often involving multiple families or clans, that stemmed from a complex mix of historical, economic, and social factors. These feuds, characterized by cycles of revenge and retaliation, were a feature of life in the mountainous regions of the eastern United States, particularly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What distinguished the kingmakers from traditional feuding families was their psychological approach to warfare. Rather than engaging in direct violence, they specialized in destroying their enemies through the legal system itself. Opponents would find themselves facing fabricated charges, losing property through questionable court decisions, or discovering that their legal documents had mysteriously disappeared from county records. Their intelligence network was extraordinary. The family maintained detailed files on every prominent individual in their sphere of influence, documenting financial irregularities, personal indiscretions, and family secrets. This information was used not for blackmail in the traditional sense, but as leverage to ensure cooperation and loyalty from those in positions of authority. The Kingmaker educational strategy was particularly sophisticated. They identified promising young people throughout the region and provided scholarships, mentorship, and career guidance. Recipients of Kingmaker support invariably found themselves indebted to the family, creating a network of obligation that extended into law schools, political circles, and federal agencies. By the 1920s, the Kingmakers controlled judicial appointments in 3 states. Their recommendations determined who became judges, their financial support decided local elections, and their legal expertise shaped legislation that affected mountain communities. They had evolved beyond crime into something resembling a shadow government. While the Hatfield-McCoy feud is the most widely known, it was far from the only one. The Appalachian region was home to numerous other conflicts, including the Martin-Tolliver feud, the French-Eversole feud, and the Hargis-Callahan Cochrell feud. Each feud had its own distinct history and nuances, but they all shared the common thread of family-based, violent conflict. The family's adaptation to changing technology and law enforcement methods demonstrated remarkable foresight. When federal agencies began investigating organized crime in the 1930s, the Kingmakers had already transitioned their operations to appear completely legitimate. Their wealth came from successful businesses, their influence from respected civic leadership, and their control from democratic processes. During World War II, they leveraged their political connections to secure lucrative government contracts while simultaneously using their legal expertise to help draft legislation that would benefit their long-term interests. The Kingmaker Foundation, established in 1943, became a respected charitable organization that funded educational programs throughout Appalachia while serving as a front for the family's continued political manipulation. The Cold War period saw the Kingmakers expand their influence into federal agencies. Family members and protégés found positions in the FBI, CIA, and other intelligence organizations. Their mountain compounds became training facilities for government operatives. Their legal expertise was consulted on matters of national security, and their regional knowledge proved valuable for agencies dealing with domestic threats. What made the Kingmaker operation virtually undetectable was their commitment to legitimacy. Unlike other criminal families who maintained parallel legal and illegal operations, the Kingmakers achieved their goals entirely through legal means. They corrupted the system not by breaking laws, but by writing them, interpreting them, and enforcing them according to their own interests. Their financial empire grew to encompass banking, real estate, energy production, and telecommunications. By the 1980s, Kingmaker holdings included major corporations, media outlets, and political action committees. They had successfully transitioned from regional crime family to influential American dynasty. The family's control over information became their most powerful weapon. Through ownership of local newspapers, radio stations, and later television networks, they could shape public perception of events throughout the region. Stories that might expose their activities were killed before publication, while favorable coverage was provided for their allies and business interests. Modern investigations into historical Appalachian criminal families consistently encounter obstacles when researching the Kingmakers. Documents disappear from archives, witnesses become uncooperative, and researchers find themselves facing unexpected legal challenges. The family's understanding of how information systems work has allowed them to effectively erase much of their criminal history from public records. In the late 19th century popular imagination, Appalachia was often mentioned in the same breath with violence, social conflict, and lawlessness. Commentators of the day applied the term feuding to sustained incidents of localized clan violence in Appalachia. Sensationalistic writing helped shape the image of the region as a primitive, untamed place. Today, the Kingmaker legacy persists through what appears to be a respected political and business dynasty. Family members hold positions as congressmen, federal judges, corporate executives, and foundation directors. Their charitable work is widely praised, their business practices are considered exemplary, and their political influence is viewed as legitimate civic engagement. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, the essential Kingmaker operation continues. They still maintain detailed intelligence files on political figures, still use their legal expertise to eliminate threats, and still operate through networks of obligation and influence that extend throughout American institutions. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental purpose remains unchanged. The transformation of the Kingmaker family from mountain criminals to American aristocracy represents the ultimate success of their strategy. They understood that true power comes not from controlling territory through violence, but from controlling institutions through influence. Their legacy serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminal organizations are often those that appear most legitimate. These 9 families, the Martin-Tolliver clan, the French-Eversole machine, the Hargis-Callahan Cochrell dynasty, the Turner-Howard Confederation, the Baker-White Alliance, the Cochrell Network, the Strong Faction, and the Kingmaker Empire represent more than historical curiosities. They demonstrate how criminal organizations adapt, evolve, and sometimes transform themselves into legitimate institutions. Bitter disputes arose between mountaineers, even over the most trivial matters. However, livestock, women, politics, and thievery were the most common sources of strife. Straying livestock, the wronging of a woman, or the killing of a dog could set friend against friend, family against family, and one part of a neighborhood against the other. Their collective legacy extends far beyond their individual territories and time periods. They pioneered techniques for political corruption, economic manipulation, and social control that influenced the development of organized crime throughout the United States. Their methods for operating through legitimate institutions, corrupting officials, and maintaining power across generations became templates for later criminal enterprises. Perhaps most significantly, these families demonstrated how geographic isolation, weak governmental authority, and strong kinship networks could combine to create criminal organizations that operated with virtual impunity for generations. They exploited the same conditions that allowed legitimate communities to develop self-reliance and independence, but twisted these values to serve criminal purposes. The mountains that once provided sanctuary for these families have been largely integrated into modern American society. Improved transportation, communication, and law enforcement have eliminated many of the conditions that allowed family-based criminal organizations to flourish. Yet their influence on criminal enterprises throughout the region and beyond persists to this day. Their stories serve as reminders that criminal organizations are not modern phenomena, but have existed wherever social conditions create opportunities for exploitation and violence. They also demonstrate how traditional values like family loyalty, community solidarity, and regional identity can be corrupted and weaponized to serve criminal purposes. In the hidden histories of America's mountain wilderness, the shadows of these 9 families still linger. Their names may have faded from public memory, but their techniques and organizational principles continue to influence criminal enterprises throughout the United States. The feuds may have ended, but the lessons learned from their violence and corruption remain as relevant today as they were when these dangerous bloodlines first carved their bloody legacy into the heart of Appalachian darkness.